Hey, good afternoon. Welcome back. Hope everybody's full from lunch. I think we're going to get started with our next panel now. This is going to be Tools for Investors. We're going to have a number of perspectives here. All of the bios of the speakers are in your packets. I think Josh was going to do a brief bio of everybody, but we have a little bigger panel this time, so we're going to focus really on the content going forward. All right, thanks so much.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. My name is Joshua Walker, and I'm over at the State Department. Luckily, I get to moderate the panel, so I don't have to actually speak, and we'll get right into the impressive bios and the words we have. Since we're going to be doing the Aspen style that I think everyone's gotten used to, we're going to jump right into the questions. You know, the panel today is really meant to, and I apologize I missed the first two ones, is really to kind of focus on the nitty-gritty of this. You know, everybody's talking about Turkey. The rise of Turkey has been well documented. Everyone has been paying attention, both in the positive and negative sense over the last month. But watching the kind of the Turkish miracle, the Turkish model, whatever term you want to use for it, it's clear that there's an opportunity here. And when you think about the way in which the U.S. government and the way in which the U.S. private sector can engage in Turkey, there are a lot of different tools available in that toolkit for a private sector company. And it's great to look out into the audience and see so many people that are kind of focused on the U.S.-Turkish relationship from a business point of view. Because for so long during the Cold War, that would be the missing leg in some ways. We focused so much on the strategic importance of Turkey, the geographic location of Turkey, and now being able to focus on business and focusing on the top 100 companies in Turkey is exciting. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what the panelists have to say, both from the private side that have direct experience of working in Turkey, their experiences of how they've engaged, and also from the government side on what some of the best practices, what tools, what things might be available out there. So I hope that each of you will start thinking through kind of the questions your company, you're dealing with, and we can engage directly on that. I'm going to try to push them as best we can. I'm going to go in the order that I have up here, which is very different than the order I have over here. And I'm going to try to do a good job of not mispronouncing everyone's name, because I feel like I've got a pretty difficult task up here. To my very far left, I have Martina Bozadzhieva, who's the Associate Practice Leader for Central and Eastern Europe, Frontier Strategy Group, who I understand is coming in from London and has a great background on these things. Welcome, Martina. And then to my immediate left, I have Andrew Brown, who's the CFA, the Vice President of Delphos International. Has done a lot of different work in Turkey and interested in your perspective on things. Welcome, Andrew. And then we have Bill Pegues, Director of the Structured Finance from the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, which I'm particularly excited about. We at the State Department are always trying to figure out ways of collaborating with OPIC and really using OPIC as kind of the way in which the private and civil side can step in a way that the U.S. government has a difficulty doing. So I'm excited to hear from Bill on that. And then to Bill's left, Celal, the President of the Turkish American Chamber of Commerce and a well-known entrepreneur himself. And so his experience both in this country and doing business as a member of the Turkish Diaspora community, which I think you probably heard about this morning from our special representative, focused on the role of the Turkish Diaspora community as well. So without further ado, let me start with Martina. Martina, you know, given your experience overseas, you know, kind of looking at the Turkish market as well as its neighbors, what would you say are the key challenges and opportunities awaiting foreign investors looking to put down roots in Turkey? And regarding those challenges, how do you propose mitigating them?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak here today. I just want to clarify that some of the things that I will share with you really come from the experience of the clients that we work with. Our company works with about 240 multinationals that do business in emerging markets. And we work with typically either heads of international or heads of region. So in the case of Turkey, it tends to be the head of Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And some of the themes that I wanted to highlight actually echo what we heard in the first panel today. In terms of both the challenges and the opportunities in the Turkish market. From the point of view of the companies that we work with, I would say there are 5 trends in terms of decision making that stand out. The first one is the need to build successful partnerships. And I wanted to highlight that because it goes to the ability of multinationals to actually do business in Turkey. This involves things like finding the right logistics partner, or finding the right distributor, or building these additional distributor relationships or franchising relationships that allow you to reach customers not just in Istanbul and Ankara, but also across Turkish geography. And for a lot of our clients, getting this right is one of the critical things they need to do in order to be able to successfully do business in the Turkish market. The second trend I wanted to highlight was around local manufacturing, and we heard about that a little bit earlier today. I would say many of our clients, as they're thinking about growing the scale of their presence in the Turkish market, are considering whether or not they need to have manufacturing facilities in the Turkish market. But it's not always a simple decision because they have to weigh that against other places where they could be manufacturing. So do I put a plant in Turkey or do I put it in Russia? What are the trade-offs? Am I going to be able to export into a broader region using this manufacturing facility? And obviously, the events more recently may have an impact on some of the risk perceptions about the long-term sustainability for these types of investment that our clients are looking at. The third trend, again, relates to something that we heard earlier today, which is the hubbing question. Can we use Turkey as a regional hub to capture markets in the Middle East, in Central Asia, maybe even in Africa? And a lot of our clients are trying to understand what is the actual opportunity to export out of Turkey and to capture these markets, also to manage them out of Turkey, especially for the smaller markets in, say, the Caucasus or Central Asia. Can we have a management team sitting in Turkey running this entire region? And what kind of efficiencies can that create for us? And then two more challenges. One is local competition. And I think today we had a great example of some of the companies that our clients need to deal with and compete with in the Turkish market, as well as broadly in other emerging markets. And this is in particular as it relates to the ability to produce at a lower cost. A lot of our clients will come in, they will bring in high quality but relatively expensive products. But the market in Turkey for those products might be relatively limited. Once they capture that market, they're obviously looking to expand into other segments, the lower to middle segment. And this is where they run against local competitors. And their ability to compete on price without sacrificing the quality and the brand that they carry with their products is one of the critical challenges that our clients are facing right now. And then finally is the issue of volatility and risk, which is perennial for clients that are working in that market. There are obviously concerns, both locally as well as in corporate, about the risk levels of Turkey, given Turkey's history of boom and bust. Are we looking at the potential bust again? And what does that mean for some of these strategic decisions that we have to make? If we set up a manufacturing facility, what if Turkey's economy crashes again? What would that do to our business? So managing to understand these trends and how they relate to their business strategy, and then really execute on the ground using local partners and local talent, I would say is the biggest issue.
All right, let me ask you one more question before I move on to our other panelists. Okay. You talked a lot about the kind of the long term of what the economy looks like. Mm-hmm. Given that how quickly and how fast the Turkish economy has grown in 2012, what do you expect in the future now in terms of, and what are the areas that, even if there are some areas that you're worried about, what are the areas that you would focus on for growth potentials for investors or potential people interested in working in Turkey?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say that Turkey actually slowed quite considerably last year. So we were looking at 8.5% growth in 2011, down to 2.5% last year. This year it looks like it's going to improve a little bit, but it's rebalancing at a lower rate than it used to have before the global financial crisis and the Eurozone crisis affected Turkish exporters. So I don't know if we're looking at long-term growth at 9%. I really don't. But with 5% growth on average, what kind of strategic decisions does that bring for you? And I think it's going to mean that multinationals need to be a lot more competitive and able to capture more of the demand that is in the market, and also at a better margin as well. They can't afford to just go into the market and grow with it. They will have to be much more competitive.
The news today, looking at where the lira hit the dollar, has not been particularly encouraging, but there comes opportunity with that as well.
Exactly.
So speaking of that, in terms of opportunity, let's turn over to the financing side of things. I know that Andrew and your company has actually had a lot of success. You have multiple financing mechanisms that you've used. So let me start there. So what are the attributes of a well-received financing proposal to an IFI or international financial institution such as OPIC or IFC that you've worked with?
Yeah, thank you, Joshua. And from our perspective, we're assisting clients really raise capital for projects, particularly capital-intensive projects in energy, expansion build-outs, in telecom, retail build-outs, housing. And we often help these clients approach the likes of, Joshua, as you mentioned, the IFC based here in Washington, or OPIC, or active in Turkey but not based here, the EBRD. Consequently, we see a lot of propositions for financing. And I think what distinguishes an application to one of these groups versus a standard commercial bank is slightly different. There's a bit more nuance, and it really requires a dual threat. It's the credit considerations that one would have as a prospective borrower or a prospective issuer, and then also I'll call it the developmental mandate or the policy mandates within that particular financial institution. We have a very high number of applications that are not applications, but of prospective clients or prospective projects that I see that really only are able to carry one of those. And I think that the really attractive, well-received propositions are dual threats, in that on the credit side, they'll have strong cash flow or strong investors. They'll also have a good track record, and they'll have a very good management. But then they also understand the nuance of the mandate, of the policy mandate of that particular financial institution. So, that's sort of abstract. Well, what's the policy mandate? Well, the one question is, okay, well, what developmental good will it do, in Turkey? Is it a renewable energy project? Will it boost employment? Will it have adverse effects on the environment? And then, again, depending on the financial institution, for example, with OPIC, I won't steal all of your thunder when we hear from Bill, but from OPIC's perspective, if it's looking at a potential project in Turkey, will this financing proposition have an adverse impact on the U.S. economy, which is another important consideration. And I think it's rare to find. It's not rare, but it's difficult. And what can make a proposition very strong is if it's a dual threat and that it understands those nuances of the developmental angles that need to be approached, and it's a very creditworthy application. The last sort of item that I'll hit on to expand upon that point, just in terms of a representative transaction, we were looking at a shipping transaction. It was strictly refinancing, very creditworthy, but given that it was really just refinancing, there wasn't an expansionary component to it, and consequently, it without having some expansionary piece adding to the economy somehow, it's not quite as attractive as it could otherwise be. So I think having that dual threat is important.
All right. So based on that, what are the kind of common pitfalls? You've talked about this kind of duality and having them strong, but you've done work around the world. I looked in your bio. You actually speak Japanese. I grew up in Japan, so I feel like we should be doing this in Japanese at a certain point. You'll learn Turkish very quickly because of the similarities that are there. What are the common pitfalls? And speaking particularly to the Turkish market, what were the things that you would tell our friends in terms of if they were trying to work with a company like yours to secure financing?
Yeah, well, I think there are a few things. One is in terms of lessons learned, let's call it, in terms of an intensive capital raising initiative, where one is trying to increase their capital base 40% or 60% or 100%, is not enough commitment of resources. Like any transaction, whether it's a new sale to a new client or financing, there has to be momentum in the transaction. And if there's a half-hearted effort and not enough resources are committed to process a particular debt raise or a capital raise, then I think that's one pitfall that we've seen. There's the idea that, well, we'll sort of hand over our financial statements and we'll get a loan approved and that's that. Unfortunately, it doesn't always work like that, particularly when you've got market risk, a potential new market risk, and then those policy risks that I mentioned. And then the second item, in addition to not committing enough resources, is really underestimating the amount of due diligence that'll be necessary. I don't want to scare anyone, but it has to go with not committing enough resources. But the amount of due diligence that's necessary, and how much time will need to be invested, and how much care will need to be massaged on behalf of that prospective borrower. I've seen companies do it very well and have very efficient transactions, but that's when they are prepared to commit resources and will put the personnel on a transaction to thoughtfully think through how to expedite a financing through a particular bank, and that doesn't even just apply to the government or bilateral sources, but that could apply to a commercial bank as well. So.
All right, thank you. Let me turn over to Bill. You've already teed up very nicely. Andrew already kind of teased us a little bit with OPIC. So why don't we just start right there? I deal with OPIC a lot, and so I feel like we should talk about it in a broader sense. Maybe those of our friends who don't know as much about it, and particularly for our Turkish friends who sometimes look at the Overseas Private Investment Corporation and say, okay, is it a government agency? How is it different than what State Department or what Exim is doing or what USAID is doing? And how does it relate to a Turkish business? Is that something that Turkish businesses, you have tools and pieces? Let's start there with you.
Okay, thanks, Josh. OPIC is the de facto development bank of the United States government. And so what we do is similar to what other organizations such as the IFC arm of the World Bank or the regional development banks such as ADB or EBRD do, which is to deploy capital in developing markets toward development ends. The difference with OPIC is that our mandate is to do it deploying US-based capital. And so one of the first gating items for any project that we finance is there has to be what we call a US nexus, which is a connection to a US investor of some sort. That can come in a variety of ways. It can be a US-based corporation, a US citizen, a dual US citizen and a citizen of the country in which we're doing the project. It can even come in terms of the sum of equity from one of those US people in tandem with long-term contracts related to the project, a long-term operation and maintenance contract, for example. One thing that I like to point out when I'm talking to people about OPIC, however, is what we're not and how we are different from other organizations that people look at within the US government that do work similar to what we do. So for example, many people are very familiar with the Export-Import Bank. And the difference between EXIM and OPIC is that whereas EXIM is financing US equipment in projects abroad, OPIC is really financing US relationships, long-term relationships over the life of our loans. And those loans can go out in some cases to well beyond 10 years to 15 years in some markets. And so it's very important for us, and it's a luxury having Andrew here, having, as Josh said, teed this up for me, in that when we're working with people from the beginning, one of the biggest challenges is to explain to them the process that we go through to determine this US nexus, the process of financing projects in a certain way, because many of the projects that we work on are not traditional corporate finance projects where you hand over your balance sheet. We look at it, we decide whether you're good credit, we have a loan agreement. They're non-recourse or limited recourse finance projects in which there is a freestanding asset and the cash flows of the asset basically service the debt. That's a much more labor-intensive and difficult type of financing to do. It's very contract-intensive. I'm trying to close a wind project in Peru right now, and I have a closing checklist of literally probably 35 different documents and contracts that govern this project financing we're doing. And so, as Andrew said, it's crucial when investors are coming in the door to try to do business with us that they understand that that kind of financing takes a long time. Because what we find quite often is that prospective sponsors are eager to work with us, but as Andrew noted, they underestimate the amount of due diligence we have to do, and they far dramatically underestimate the labor intensiveness of the papering of the loan process, the documenting and negotiating of the loan process. And all borrowers want their money yesterday. And one of the big challenges that we have up front is explaining that actually that's not going to come until far down the line. And so managing those expectations from the beginning is particularly challenging for us.
Can you focus specifically on Turkey for us and what OPIC is doing there? I know that OPIC has made Turkey somewhat of a priority given the number of projects, everything else. Can you just go through some of those, maybe things that we've not heard about or have been in the news, but we didn't know that OPIC was the one behind it?
And I'll back up for a minute and note that OPIC is just about over 30 years old. It was formed in 1971. And actually, it was formed to serve as a political insurance vehicle for projects that USAID funded in the developing world. And over the years, in the 80s, OPIC branched out of political risk insurance and into traditional lending. So for example, I work in the structured finance group at OPIC, and we deal with large capitalization loans to mainly energy and infrastructure projects. We also have a finance group that deals with small and medium enterprise businesses, and we have a separate investment funds business. In Turkey, we have a long track record in Turkey dating back to the late 70s, early 80s when we began to do political risk insurance there. And I took a look yesterday before I came over, and over the years, OPIC has done over $2 billion worth of loans to basically about 40 to 45 different Turkish projects. We've done over $1.5 billion in notional in political risk insurance and various insurance products on projects there. On the loan side, that $2 billion is really concentrated in the last 15 years. Since 2000, we've made $1.7 billion into 35 separate projects in Turkey. And those range across financial services. We've done a lot of on-lending through banks in Turkey. We have framework agreements with US banks that we will lend through to Turkish banks. We finance power projects there. We've done a variety of smaller businesses and various sorts of manufacturing businesses and so forth. And so we have a long and very successful track record there. And I'll interject a personal note here, which is I came to OPIC a little less than 2 years ago. And one of my interests is trying to develop some business in Turkey because my wife is Turkish. I've spent a great deal of time there during the past decade. I know the country well. I have a great affection for the people and the culture. And I'm really interested in the economic dynamism that's gone on in Turkey over the past decade. On the other side of that, one of the challenges that OPIC has is that because we're a development financing agency, we're basically limited in the countries that we can work in. So we've done a lot of projects in Turkey over the year, but Turkey is in the enviable position now of having a high enough GDP per capita that it's about to move outside of our scope and ability to finance projects there. So I'm trying to do two things, and my colleagues are too, which is number one, to try and get in some projects in the next couple years before that window of direct project financing in Turkey closes, so that we can do some more projects there. But beyond that, one thing that I noticed long before I went to OPIC, being in Turkey and talking to my family there and to business people I met, is that there has been a change in the Turkish business culture toward looking more broadly abroad to deploy capital. And in particular outside of the traditional areas of Eastern Europe and Russia and some of the former Soviet republics, now looking toward a much broader area. And one of the things that I'm trying to do now is try to determine where are the relationships where we can pair some US equity participants with Turkish capital being deployed, for example, in Africa. I'm working on a project right now that's about to get going with the Turkish company that's looking at developing some energy projects in Pakistan. Very, very difficult place to do business, but they have a particular expertise that makes it quite likely that they'll be successful there. And those are the sorts of opportunities going forward that OPIC will be focusing on.
Great. I'm going to leave it there for now and come back to you. I think there will be some other questions, but I want to push you on some of these things. That sounds great. I'm really excited to hear that. Last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Secilmis, who's the president of the Turkish American Chamber of Commerce and Industry. So I'm going to start with a question there, Celal Bey. Can you address the role of the Turkish American Chamber of Commerce and Industry? What is it doing, and how is it supporting bilateral trade and helping U.S. companies and individuals learn about investing in Turkey?
Definitely. Turkish American Chamber of Commerce and Industry is a U.S. company, non-profit membership company that is formed according to U.S. laws, 501 C6 rather, that arranges the Chambers of Commerce. So we are a U.S. entity. The mission of the Chamber is bilaterally to enhance the business and investment between Turkey and U.S. Therefore, we serve American businessmen and investors as well as Turkish businessmen and investors who want to do investment and trade in each other's countries. First of all, chambers, I think, are less utilized sources out there that can offer much more than a businessman takes advantage of. We offer what we call the human-to-human touch to American investors, especially for a common American businessman who wants to expand internationally. Sometimes we find that, let alone having been to Turkey or done business in Turkey or done business with a Turkish company, they've never even met a Turkish person. So us being here in the US and having given access to American businesses and investors opens the door, first of all, to human contact, which I think leads to, first of all, comfort and understanding, and also gives access to the American businesses, our resources, both private and governmental resources in Turkey. We are affiliated with TOBB. Under their umbrella, they have 358 chambers and exchanges, which expands to over 1.5 million member companies. So through us, we can hook them up in every part of Turkey, in remote parts of Turkey, with dependable chamber member, credited parties, and try to suit their needs, let it be finding a buyer or a seller or a possible partnership. What we do as a chamber usually is when American companies get in touch with us and showing their interest in doing business or investing in Turkey, we try to include them in our trade missions. We have several trade missions in different industries to Turkey. Sometimes as small as a dozen companies, as large as 24 companies and businessmen. We divide them into industries and interest groups and take them to first to give them a global picture of the business climate, investment climate in Turkey, and then take them to their corresponding cities or the areas where their industry is very strong. Try to sit them down on a table with their counterparts in Turkey and have them the chance to face-to-face, first-hand information exchange. We find that this type of an initiative breaks the ice. People, after especially getting socially in the same atmosphere, they relax, all the guards drop, and it becomes more of a human aspect rather than the politics and the making money. All the other aspects become secondary, which I think our earlier panelists have repeatedly talked about, confidence and trust, which is very important in international trade. We do the same thing for the Turkish businessman who wants to expand to US. And also, what we do is this could be as small as recommending a right attorney or finding a right bank or finding an accountant in Turkey or as big as a multi-million-dollar investment in Turkey. We hook them up with right business partners. I think it's very important if for any company expanding into any international market to have the right partners. We recommend a right banker. We have two of them here. We recommend a right law firm because the laws are different, and especially between US and Turkey. It's somewhat different. We recommend a right accountant. And most importantly, we recommend them the right governmental or an NGO partner in Turkey to hook them up with and to share their resources, basically. What we find that there is, once that human contact is accomplished, it's very much easier to do business. We have taken over the, this is my second term going into fourth year as the chamber president. In my term, we have taken over 250 US firms to Turkey, and some of them have been very successful in accomplishing very big business investments. But the least we have gotten out of those trade missions is they have made contacts, they have kept relationships, and improved those relationships into a business transaction. If not, have become personal friends and have kept that relationship, which hopefully will lead to a business relationship. So our mission as a chamber is bilateral, and our door is open to first to our members, but also non-members can take advantage of our resources.
Great. switching from the chamber perspective to your own personal background as a Turkish American and having deep experiences on both sides of the Atlantic, can you kind of offer us some of the best practices or things? I mean, this is what you do. You're also a professor as well. So, can you kind of give us the highlights in terms of the best practices if you have people who either want to do business in Turkey from the U.S. perspective or Turks who want to enter the American market to find the right type of partner in the U.S.?
First of all, as cultures are different, business culture is also different. It's very important for American businessmen to understand the business culture in Turkey. Sometimes the negative experience that I can share with is solely by not understanding the local business culture and assuming that everything will go the way it goes in the United States, which that's why we recommend right partners in the other country you're interested in. I might say that Turkish government have done more than their share during the last 5-6 years to make it as easy for an investor as possible. Right now, any foreign investor has the same rights as a Turkish investor. Have access to the same incentives, have access to the same bureaucracy. Nothing extra is required by from foreign investors. Government has several international agencies that offer turnkey solutions and one-step shopping solutions, such as ISPAT, Investment Support and Promotion Agency of Turkey. If you're interested in investturkey.gov, directly tied to the Prime Minister's office. They have 5 representatives across the United States. We work very closely with them. They hold hand to hand and take you step by step. In as little as 1 week, you can form a corporation, you can open a bank account, you can register with the tax department, and be ready to function as a business in Turkey. That's how easy it has become. But still, there are things that are very hard, very difficult for an American businessman to understand. Is if you have to realize Turkish economy has become an export-driven economy. That's why it has grown so fast and so steadily. This has some growing pains. And of that, they learn from the experiences very quickly, and they adjust to the experiences. So the important thing for us as a chamber, we don't want our members or the parties that we are helping to get into investment or in Turkish market, we don't want them to come out with bad experience, bad taste in their mouth. Because one bad taste can erase out a dozen of good tastes. So it's very important for us to make them understand before they step into Turkish soil that there are business cultural differences and you have to be ready for it, and there are ways of solving it, and we try to walk them through what they should do and how they should proceed. We do the same thing for the Turkish businesses to come and first of all, what industry is strong in what state, state development agencies, what they offer incentive-wise, where is it profitable, more profitable for them to open a business and start manufacturing or start a logistics center, whatever. So we basically hold hands and walk them through the steps. And I find that those who take advantage of the chambers for what they offer in their capacity come out with more success, enter into the investment or business in a shorter time with a less expense, and come out more successful.
Great, thank you. I think there's more than enough food for thought here. I know it's right after lunch. Everyone always has that look after you've had your stomach satiated where there's a tendency to be passive. But I'm going to start picking on people. If I don't see people's hands go up, I'll look at your face and say, you look like you have a question. So be thinking about that. But before I turn to you, let me ask a few questions just to get everyone thinking. I saw your hand was on, so I'm going to hold you to that. Let me ask you two very quick questions, and I'm going to ask every panelist to respond. And if you have anything in particular you'd like to respond to what the other panelists said. You're sitting in front of the Secretary of State, and you've got to give him advice. This is very self-serving, as you can probably see where I'm going with this. In terms of improving the U.S.-Turkish relationship, in terms of the role of the private sector, what one piece of advice, from your background, you would say, focus on this, and this is the key point? One on that side. On the other side, you're sitting looking at kind of the Chamber of Commerce in Turkey, and you're giving advice to your boss, Refat Bey, and you're saying, what can the private sector do to make it more attractive in terms of doing more work in the role? What advice would you give? And I'll start down here with Martina. But before we do that, I was kind of remiss beforehand not to point out that our host at Aspen and kind of the Partners for New Beginning initiative is all about this. And so I was really excited in everyone's panel and everyone's presentation. You focused on a different aspect of what Partners for New Beginning is all about, and thinking about the role that Turkey can play, not only in its own internal sense, in terms of the geography that incorporates almost 80 million people in terms of the market, but the larger Turkic world, farther to the east, going all the way to China, thinking about the Middle East, Africa. It really has become this global hub. And sometimes I feel in America, we tend to be a little bit behind the curve. And so the only time we think about Turkey tends to be on Thanksgiving, unfortunately, sometimes. And so being able to kind of change that viewpoint is particularly, I think, the focus of a place like Partners for New Beginning that's incorporated in 11 different countries throughout the region. So I just want to say thank you on behalf of all of us that work on this all the time. I know there's a lot of other government folks coming through, but I have a personal connection to PNB, so I wanted to at least put that out there. And now I've given you enough time to hopefully think of something when I come to you, Martina.
Sure, thank you. I think for the U.S. side, it's really a question about education and understanding what goes beyond the headlines. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because the client that we work with, say head of EMEA, based in Europe, maybe even based in Turkey, knows and understands what it means to actually operate in that market, understands that, let's say, the protests that were happening don't actually affect their bottom line, they don't affect their employees or their manufacturing, but at the same time, their boss, sitting in the U.S., is reading these headlines and, let's say, calling them on the phone in the middle of the night and saying, what's going on? I think that this disconnect between the reality on the ground and then corporate perceptions that are shaped by US media, that are shaped by their background and experience, can really sometimes block investment and trade opportunities. I've seen that in particular in the case of Russia, where very negative perceptions are resulting in companies just not investing in the market because of corporate pushback. But in the case of Turkey as well, I think especially with the more recent events, if these events manage to harm the image that Turkey has in the US market, they could have actual impact on investment levels in the market. And so I think the US government certainly can play a role in enhancing this understanding, educating the US corporate elite, maybe having a more prominent position in the media in explaining how the reality on the ground differs from perhaps what the journalists would like to focus on, which of course is very exciting, but it's also not what's affecting businesses. And then on the Turkish side, I think it's also partly about education, but also about risk mitigation and understanding what are the kinds of things that are really affecting the ability of a company to run a business there. So we heard that from GE earlier today, where while there are incentives available for companies, the actual ability of multinationals to take advantage of those incentives could be limited. And in some cases, it could make the difference between making an investment or not making an investment. So having a collaborative process of understanding what it is that foreign investors are able to commit versus what it is that the government is looking to accomplish, both of which are very important. And having that dialogue is probably one of the critical steps.
Great, thank you. Andrew.
I think on the policy side, I would encourage I guess on the U.S. policy side, I would encourage, let's call it more liberal programs in many elements with respect to some of the restrictions that are placed on, for example, OPIC, EXIM, and then other advocacy groups that are active within the market. Speaking from experience, I've seen examples from competitors. So, for example, Canada, EDC, Export Development Canada, which is their official, both their development bank and their export credit agency, was in many instances much more aggressive to support Canadian businesses, I found, then in some instances the U.S. agencies are allowed to support U.S. businesses. So sort of a removal of some of those shackles, and then more I guess more aggressive pursuit of other advocacy programs in country.
Okay.
So.
Bill?
Well, I'll mirror what Andrew said there. I think on the policy side, I second all of that. And also one thing that I think about, at OPIC in particular, we're a bit constrained because we operate under a greenhouse gas cap for emissions. And this is an agreement that we entered into about 6 or 7 years ago that really limits the amount of power projects that we can do. And so right now, we're doing a lot of renewable energy projects around the world. We're very heartened to see that Turkey has come out with a solicitation for solar projects, and we'd like to be involved in that. Obviously, wind and solar, some tremendous resources in the country. But I've been working in oil and gas and power around the world for 22 years, and it's quite clear that you want, as a development agency, what I think of as a very long lever to move a heavy object. And there are so many people around the world who still don't have access to safe, reliable supplies of electricity. Turkey, fortunately, isn't one of those places, but there's a tremendous opportunity right now in Turkey, for example, to finance expansion of conventional power generation, particularly where gas generation is involved, and to encourage more reliable supplies and more diverse supplies of natural gas into Turkey, which is an ongoing concern of the Turkish government. And from a policy point of view, I'd like to see us be able to work on more of these sorts of projects, not only in Turkey but around the world, and also to focus on helping Turkey become a nexus of supply of all sorts of energy, and not as it has been in the past, sort of constrained by where it gets its natural gas from and how it can power its economy.
Thank you. Celal Bey?
To your answer to your boss on the policy side, Joshua, I would urge U.S. to look more closely to the local area and to the particular country. Try to not look at solely from U.S. perspective, but try to entertain and fulfill the expectation of the local people. How could that be? As my colleagues have referred, maybe offering special financing packages for important projects that are important for the locality. That would allow the local, in this case, Turkish citizens to look at America in a different perspective, rather than with the belief that we have, if it is not to their advantage, it definitely will not happen. On the Turkish side, I think risk mitigation is very important. It is a very uncertain area for U.S. investors, especially given the current situation. And I agree with Martina that it is what is happening in actuality and what we see in the media is somewhat different. And I think the U.S. has a great responsibility in managing this crisis as well, and having the Turkish government to better manage and come out of it with less damage on both economic and political avenues.
Great, thank you. Hope you guys are thinking those questions. Just put your hand up and grab my attention. But I saw Ozan, who is a good student from Harvard, knows how to ask the first question. Ozan Bey. Just introduce yourself for anyone who doesn't know, I guess. We all know who you are.
I already introduced you in the previous panel. So thank you very much for this great discussion. My question goes to William. So as you said, Turkey's income level is improving, and Turkey is about to graduate the level of from the group of countries that can benefit the financing opportunities of OPIC and World Bank, IMF maybe. So, but another thing is happening in Turkey as well as the income level is increasing. Turkey became a donor country in the international aid community, and we are very, like, Turkish aid agency is very active in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. Do you provide any financing to these kind of investments, let's say the dams, some highways that are constructed by Turkish aid agency in sub-Saharan African countries? Maybe this might be another avenue that you can interact with Turkish government agencies in the future.
Well, it's a good question, Ozan Bey. Again, we have to get back to our fundamental requirement, which is we can finance projects as long as there's a U.S. connection in them. When it comes to financing, for example, projects that Turkish aid would be investing in sub-Saharan Africa, we can't lend directly to a foreign government. We can lend through a vehicle in which investors are involved. And in fact, I don't know even if a government could be involved in that investment vehicle or whether that's completely off limits. But what we really seek out is the involvement of private entities. So for example, we do a lot of work with USAID around the world, although they're usually not involved directly in our projects. We're looking at more areas where we can use some of their grant money as equity and it qualifies. But on the foreign government side, that's just ground that we haven't explored yet. But I'd be very happy to talk to some of my colleagues about this and get back to you with a clearer question about whether that might even be possible. Right off the top, I would say it'd be very difficult to impossible. But sub-Saharan Africa is one of our focus areas, and we would really like to be able to figure out how to do those projects.
Gentleman right over here.
My name is Akin Sawyer. I had sort of a similar question to that, but it was kind of more into the internal operations at your organization. So do you actively look at ways to facilitate private business, right? So if it's a Turkish firm that's looking to get into construction in Nigeria, for example, or Ghana, right, and they're export-oriented, they're trying to expand, right, do you actively find ways to kind of then connect them to partners on the ground and then try to essentially, you know, use that as a way to finance these opportunities? I say that as a Nigerian American, for example, where, you know, from my perspective, there are all these opportunities that exist in Nigeria, and it'll be great to find good Turkish partners that are looking to kind of enter the market and kind of be that nexus, so to speak. So how actively do you do that? Is that part of the strategy and the approach you guys take?
We don't really actively do that, and that's largely a matter of our size. We're very small. In fact, I think we may be the smallest U.S. federal government agency. And so while we're not capital constrained, we're very human resource constrained. And so we're a very lean, flat organization, and we're all working on many deals at one time. I wish we had the capability to do that sort of matchmaking, and we do where we can to an extent. In Nigeria, for example, one of my colleagues is working on a project there right now, but that is with US and Nigerian investors who found each other. And when I've worked with investors in Nigeria over the past year and a half, the two that I've worked with have been American investors, one of whom grew up in Nigeria and Ghana and is familiar with the region and wants to go back and invest there.
Next question. Not seeing any right now. I'm going to go ahead and fill the blank with some of the questions I had as well. You guys all at some point in time touched on the kind of personal aspect of Turkey, and I'm surprised, I'm amazed constantly that there's always this human connection, and no matter how much we talk about business and the bottom line, there seems to be something that's compelling about Turkey, that whether it's a visit to Turkey where you fall in love with the people and the energy and all the excitement, there's this element of it. And yet at the same time, I think what both of you at the end referred to in terms of this portrayal of Turkey, whenever something sensational happens, there's a tendency, and I think in Washington, given the political situation, sometimes there's a tendency, there's a disconnect between what you experience on the ground in Turkey and the great hospitality and just kind of the opportunities that are there when you see them with your own eyes and the way they're portrayed sometimes. Can you kind of elaborate on that? I'm going to start probably with Bill, since you kind of opened that with the personal story about why you were personally interested in it. Can you speak more to that? And I'll ask each of the panelists if they have an idea And in the meantime, I'm going to be surveying around, and I will start calling on people if I don't see questions to fill the next 5 to 10 minutes.
Certainly. I mean, I can go back to the first time I visited Turkey when I met my wife. And I mean, besides being just overwhelmed with the hospitality of the people and the fact that my wife is from Antep. And so the food,
good baklava is what you mean?
Yeah, it is the baklava center of the universe. Do you have any idea how much I have to spend in the gym? But I think there's something that really grabbed me. I go back to the beginning of my career when I worked in Southeast Asia. And I had the good fortune to be in Thailand in the early 90s when that economy was just, you could literally see it growing. It was organic, and I would go about every 12 weeks, and you could literally see things change. And I was in my 20s at the time, and it just captivated me, the economics of it, the social aspects and everything. The first time I went to Turkey, what really, really struck me when I talked to people is just how much energy they had, how well educated I found them. And what frustrated me, and especially in Gaziantep, which for most people here who are not from Turkey aren't familiar with it, it's a city, a large light manufacturing center about 100 miles north of Aleppo in Syria, just at the end of the Mediterranean Sea up in the mountains. And it's not Istanbul, it's not Izmir, it's a very, very different place. It is much more Anatolian. And what frustrated me there was I saw all of this energy, but it's sort of the story of economic development is decreasing the amount of labor and increasing the amount of capital. That again gets back to the lever with which you can move large objects. And whereas I saw that at work in Izmir and Istanbul, for example, in Gaziantep I saw it to a much less extent. They needed longer levers. And I just saw a great capacity there for growth. And as I've gone back and even in the past years seen Gaziantep change, there's just something, I've always loved the nexus of economics, politics, and technology. That's why I got into the oil and gas business 20 years ago. That's why I like power so much. Because these things come together and there are so many different aspects to them and they really change people's lives. And I saw all of this at work in Turkey, and that's really what captured me.
Okay. Andrew?
Well, I don't have quite the intimate connection with Turkey as some of my co-panelists. I was introduced to Turkey through my frequent trips on Turkish Airlines to East Africa, but that turned into a holiday then later, so that was good. But I mean, more seriously, my perception, just having done work though there and in the market, let me step back and first just paint the complexion that in addition to Turkey, we do a lot of other work in the Middle East. It includes Iraq, a lot of work in sub-Saharan Africa. So, from my perspective, and a lot of the investment clientele that I work with, sort of the recent trouble with Taksim Square and civil disobedience is really no big deal. It's well, Turkey's still one of the most attractive investment environments. To give you some perspective, just in terms of how I think this is relatively insignificant. A few years ago, we were closing a transaction in Kenya, and if anyone remembers, there was a lot of, after the election, there was violence. Just over 1,000 people were killed, 600,000 people displaced. We closed a $50 million loan within 60 days after that happened. So, I'll transfer that to say I think that generally I think that Turkey is still relatively viewed. My perspective being the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, and North America, with a very optimistic and positive viewpoint, perhaps as strong as any other market, I think.
Great. Martina?
I'd like to tell a story, actually. I think it illustrates the point that we're all making in one way or another. About 8 months ago, we had a client, head of EMEA, for a relatively medium-sized European company, come to us and ask us for a little bit of help in managing the conversation with corporate. He was asking for some resources to hire a few additional people in a few markets across the emerging markets portfolio. And one of those markets was Turkey. He wanted to hire 2 extra people in Turkey. No big deal, but for that company, it was a pretty big investment. And his problem was that he was getting a lot of pushback around risk from the legal department on compliance issues, and he was just not making progress. But at the same time, he knew that in order to grow, he needed these people on the ground and running. So he invited us to basically present an external point of view to his corporate team, and in particular the CEO, just to bring in a different perspective, because obviously he's biased. He has something that he wants, and it makes it a little bit difficult at some point to break that conversation. So we came in and we talked about opportunities across their portfolio of emerging markets. We showed how Turkey is one of the top opportunities, how they're probably extremely underinvested in that market, and how, yes, it makes perfect sense for your team to actually put a person on the ground. And the CEO said that he had been in Turkey and worked there for a couple of years, and last time he was there was in 2000. And he asked, has anything changed? So this is the kind of perception that you have to deal with, because you have to educate people who don't normally follow this market on a regular basis that, yes, a lot of things have changed in Turkey since 2000. But from his point of view, his decisions are based on the perception of Turkey as it was in 2000. And this is where I think better education can really come and play a very strong role.
Great. Celal Bey?
Things have changed definitely since 2000, but you have to realize, go back a little bit further back than 2000 in Turkish history, going back to Ottoman era, and U.S. Immigration from Turkey to U.S. Has started really in 1960s, 1970s. So Turkish Americans are rather newcomers to this country versus Irish and other groups who came in the earlier years. So we're dealing with a decade of at least misconception and uncertainty that is in that region of the world. First of all, those Americans who have never been to Turkey and rarely maybe met a Turkish individual, their concept of Turkey is from what they gather from the movies or from the newscasts. And unfortunately, that hasn't been that much positive. So that's why it's very important to the human-to-human touch, and especially seeing Turkey in its place as a country and as people. We have Turkish Diaspora. I have a different hat that I have, which I represent World Turkish Business Council in the Americas region. It's a new diaspora organization that are formed to organize the Turkish diaspora. The largest part of Turkish population as diasporas are in Europe, started in, again, that's in 1950s, as Turkish workers traveling to Germany mainly. But misconception, and in order to correct that, years of misconception is the only way to correct it is the human touch.
Got it. I think we have maybe time for at least one more question before, unless people want to go directly to the sugar time. I don't think we have baklava, unfortunately, but I see a question over here, please.
I want to explore this trust issue a little bit more, the reputation of Turkey, because I feel like despite the long history of Turkish-American relationships and the American culture being a very trusting culture, that comes out in statistics, what do you think is the reason for the trust gap, the main reason? Is it what I suspect a little bit, that the two cultures build trust in different ways? One builds trust through getting to know each other and the attributes of the other person, and the other one builds trust through what gets done. And for that reason, I highly recommend the brand development for growing companies in the United States. Or is there some sort of more reputation management to be done that you would recommend, and who should take a role in that on behalf of Turkey, as well as the U.S.? There are some trust gaps for the U.S. in Turkey as well. So who could do better reputation management on both sides?
Is there anybody who wants to jump on that right away?
I will take that. I think the relationship, long-standing relationship, it has been basically a military relationship that hasn't been able to jump to the second level where the trust between the people have. That's why that gap, trust gap between the people. I think I can speak, since I'm a dual citizen, both American and Turkish, I can play devil's advocate in both sides. So I think Turkish citizens look at America as being used by America for strategic and military reasons. And if it is to America's advantage, something happens. If it is not to America's advantage, nothing will happen. So that's why we in business community try to emphasize that there is a, yes, there's a military aspect. Yes, there is a strategic aspect because of the geographic location of Turkey. But there is the most important aspect that would the other aspects benefit from is the business aspect. And I think in the American side, maybe Joshua is now with his new head will be better handle that. And in Americans, I don't know whether you can call not trusting the Turkish, but it's the uncertainty, not knowing what is out there, basically, causing the trust.
I have just a couple observations on that. So I think coming from the American side, the thing that I've always noticed is that, for example, people I know who travel, they have no problem conceiving of and taking a trip to the Greek islands. But for some reason, there is some sort of mental or cultural barrier in going further than that into Turkey. And that persists to this day in people I talk to. And I'm happy to say over the past 5 years, I notice it less and less. And I don't know what it is. I think that for a lot of Americans in the educational system, you learn about Turkey in the context of the Byzantines in Constantinople. And then basically with the Ottoman conquest, unless you study history at university, you don't really go further and really learn a great deal about the culture. And until recently, Turkey really wasn't in the news that much. And so for Americans who are outward oriented, unless you had a real curiosity about learning more about the country, you didn't. I can say certainly from my perspective of the Turkish side, talking to people there over the past years when I visit my wife's family and other people, one thing Americans have to understand is that, and don't, I think, is that back when my wife and I were growing up in the 70s and the 80s, Turkey was still a front in the war between the US and the Soviets. And there were proxy battles there. Fortunately, they weren't nearly as violent as they were in other parts of the world. But you know, I know people there who are scarred by that, what they see as an exercise of American power on that front. And that is a generational perspective that will take a while to dissipate in Turkey. And I think it's a very, very important factor. One thing that's really heartened me is Turkey's never had this kind of 10-year period of rapid growth and sort of greater outward orientation to other markets. And I see that reciprocated in so much more tourism there. Istanbul is just such a tourist destination these days. And I think from an American point of view, that is a very good thing for Americans. I sort of have a hobby in being a tour guide for my friends and family who go there. And invariably, I've never had anybody come back from a trip to Turkey and not have just been blown away by what they find there. And I hope that that continues. And I think on the trust front, that's the greatest hope always is for spreading greater prosperity so that people can get closer to human experiences with other cultures. And that's what I've seen happening in Turkey over the past decade with Americans and vice versa.
I think it's actually a great note to end on, and I'll just say inshallah the same way. I think that we're among friends here, and obviously there's a lot of work to be done, but I think through conferences like this, through networking like this is an opportunity. So without further ado, I'll turn it over so we can have a networking break at coffee. But if you'll join me in thanking the panel for their excellent remarks. Thank you very much.